Welcome everybody. Yes.
Hey, here, Stephanie, I'm sure.
Austin Rehbein is gonna start today and lead us in exposing us to her ideas about.
Will you tell me some of the things that you've talked about so far in this class, things that have been exciting or new? What are the topics of the month?
Well, I have participated primarily these last few weeks online and then come here. But I think it's starting with Kelly covering progressive theology and what that looks like and some of the meaning behind it. And I think that's my key word.
What has that? What was the description of progressive theology that was new to you?
Well, I had a time of looking at progressive as something that might be left, and my evangelism side, where I was brought up, I was looked at as being right, not right by everything, but progressive is welcoming all. To me, is open, and there's no idea of we're different, we're all together.
Wonderful. And we did, so Kelly had the first class, and she really did focus on authors with different backgrounds and exposing us to queer, or at least talking about that there's queer theology and feminist theology and Black liberation theology and disabled theology, and just telling us that, but also introducing us to some of the books. And then the other classes in between, I actually just went online and found some authors who have written books in the last few years, last 3 or 4 years, that I had, in most cases, never heard of. And many of them are also politically active because they're responding to conservative Christianity, which has been politically active, and progressives tend to be quiet and not speak up. So some of them are ones who are saying, look, we need to A, speak up and let the world know we're here, because a lot of people don't, and B, speak up on particular issues. They're not talking about partisan politics, but particular issues having to do with inclusion or other matters like that, and actually step forward, which generally progressives don't like to do either.
Yeah.
So a few authors we didn't know about.
Wonderful. What are some of their names?
One of them is Guthrie Graves Simmons. Another one is Jennifer Butler, and both of those are very active in DC and lobbying things. Another one, Diana Butler Bass, has been around for a long time. We were familiar with her too, but she has a new book where she talks about her life and how she went through different understandings of Jesus. And so she calls it memoir theology. And she went through a phase where she was with an evangelical group, a couple of different evangelical groups and seminaries. And so she talks about some of the views she had of Jesus during those phases of her life, and then the views she has now. So how she personally evolved, which allows us, I mean, Ethan understands evangelicalism from the inside, but I don't, because I was never exposed to it. So kind of she looks at it from the inside as well as from the outside. So she can kind of see it at different definitions of Savior, for instance, and Lord, which are not were new to me.
Yeah, wonderful. I heard her give a sermon during the pandemic where she used the phrase temporal dislocation. And that was really helpful, because during the pandemic, do you remember a time when you've been in your house for so many days that all of a sudden you stop remembering how long you've been there, or you've been at home with your mom in Phoenix for 2 months and it feels like it's been 2 weeks and you're
Or for 2 years.
Yeah. So that was really helpful. You're like, oh yeah, we're temporally dislocated. Yeah, our bodies have stopped having a sense of the time. And that has very slowly come back to me, but I'm still like, was I here 1 month ago or 5 months ago? It's unclear. No, could you guys, this is One more again, I'll be in the back row, you can share. Got some PDFs of the book that we're looking at today. So my background was more like Ethan's. I grew up in a really large evangelical church in Wisconsin, like 10,000 members large. So, you know, I didn't know that I went to an evangelical non-denominational church until I was filling out college applications and was like, Mom, what kind of church should we go to? They're asking, and I don't know, because denominations were not something that we talked about. I didn't know what Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal meant. I didn't know Catholics were still Christians.
Yeah.
So I went to now I would call it a fundamentalist private school, K through 8th grade. So, you know, grew up having Bible class every day, which now I'm really grateful for because I know the Bible really well. But over time, I grew to see it in a different way. I also appreciated that foundation because it taught me that I could approach faith academically. So it was faith in school as a class. It wasn't just faith in church where there's a little bit maybe less questioning. So that set me up really well. I went to a Christian school in Southern California, Azusa Pacific. And I didn't know that there was liberal and conservative theology at that point. I just knew that my professors were really, really smart and I really liked everything they had to say. And I came out of Azusa and all of a sudden my faith and my theology was in a very different place. But I feel very lucky that I never went through a crisis of belief. I never went through the breakdown and the rebuilding. It just felt like a natural progression of learning more and learning more. And if we take this seriously, then we have to look at all of our lives, all of our society in this way. And all of a sudden I was like, I think I lean liberal politically. What do I do with that?
Politically or theologically?
Politically, because I grew up with the idea that Democrats aren't Christians. So I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Now I probably lean further in the opposite. But that was my upbringing. I feel like Diana Butler Bass, then I have a good understanding of the insides of both sides of the red church and the blue church, if you will. So then I went to seminary and for the first time learned about how faith is political and came out of the heavy theology of undergrad and into what my faith needs to look like in the world, what social ethics look like according to faith. And it was a whole new world, but I was really grateful again that I never went through the deconstruction, the crisis. It just felt like a natural progression, which I think was really cool. So some of the books that I point to, I know Kelly talked about this one, Inspired by Rachel Held Evans, is a really helpful book that talks, it's like her love letter to scripture, she calls it. The way that she came to see scripture as much fuller than her Baptist upbringing led her to believe or taught her originally. And when people ask me, how did you go from here to there? I'm like, I don't really know. In 8 years of theological study, I felt like I went underwater and came up somewhere else. And so it's hard, you know, when my mom asks me, how do you think the Bible isn't for you for people? Okay, can you explain that to me? Because I would like to know. I'm like, I don't know where to start. It was 8 years long, that progress. So Inspired is one of those books that I point to, and I'm like, this names that transition that I have a hard time because it happened over time. Another book that I sent her that she was so happy about. Maybe you've heard of this. It's by a Presbyterian guy named Mark Optemeyer. It's the Scripture's Yes to Same-Sex Marriage, a short book, and it deals with all of the traditional clobber passages, the passages that people will point to. As these are the 6 or 7 passages in Scripture that that point to anti-gay theology. Kelly does a great job at running through them so quick. I don't know if she has a lecture online where she does it and it's just like boom, 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 boom. It's wonderful. So that book has done that really well. And I bought a whole stack of them and I've been giving them like candy. So if you have any people that you know that are wondering about how to process that question for the first time, I highly recommend keeping a stack of those books. And scripted yes to same-sex marriage. Do you have any questions for me before I jump into our book from today?
Well, what are all those books?
Oh, these are so many books.
Or do you want to jump in first and then talk about it?
I might talk about some of these at the end.
Okay.
But a book that I brought with me, I didn't have much time to read because I couldn't find it at the library. It just came in the mail yesterday. Is Decolonizing Christianity. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more at the end. After we go through some of this book, I'm going to talk about how I relate to the phrase, the designation progressive theology and what that means to me, and why I'm not incredibly crazy about the term.
Oh,
Stay tuned. Well, for one, I'm going to do a little spoiler right now. I think if we say progressive theology, it sounds like it's something new. I don't think it's something new. I think it's recovering something that Christianity always had within it, that it is intended to be. So my partner works at SPU, and there was a lecture last week, a reconciliation day. Brenda Salter McNeil, is that a name that you've heard? Yeah, I got to hear her preach for the first time. She was incredible. But also theologian Stanley Hauerwas was there. He has done a lot of political theology. He is from Texas. An incredible human that I got to hold his hand twice because they told us to pray at our table. So I was a little bit starstruck. But he used a phrase that I thought was really helpful. He distinguished between Christianity and Christendom. So he uses the word Christendom to talk about the Christianity of empire. And I think that if Christianity is ever in power, it becomes less of what it was intended to be. So especially when Christianity is used for power, it becomes completely distorted. So I thought that was really helpful. So instead of saying conservative theology and progressive theology, maybe this is arrogant of me, I want to say good theology and distorted theology, or theology and Christendom. So those are, I was really grateful for that phrasing that he had. Christendom, which, yeah. One of the students in youth group recently told me, she comes with a friend, and so the first day she was like, I've only ever heard about Christianity as like something that colonizers used. I'm curious to hear a different perspective. So that was very exciting to be like, oh, I'm so excited, let me tell you, but also like I appreciate the distinction, Christianity, Christendom. Let's not confuse the two. So the book that I'm talking about today is The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And I, embarrassingly, Ethan, when you were talking, I was rudely on my phone because I remembered I had to look up when it was written, because there were a couple dates in the front and I had been reading it thinking it was written in the 70s. That's not true. It was published in 2011. So it is newer than I thought that it was, which means that I was in college reading it 2 years after it came out and I had thought it was an old book then. So it's a little bit shocking to me that this idea was so recent. So this is by a Black theologian, James Cohn. And one of the things he talks about in here is him and Martin Luther King Jr. both being teenagers when Emmett Till was lynched. So he grew up during a time when lynching was still happening. I think it was probably outlawed at that time, but to little effect. He wrote several books in the 70s. He also wrote The God of the Oppressed, which I think some of his ideas feel obvious. They might sound obvious to us, but they were so new because so much of the dominant theology of the day was blind to the issues that he was bringing up. So, God of the Oppressed says that God is the God of the oppressed, not of the powerful. And then this book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, he is making a case for how similar deaths, being crucified and being lynched were, and that to miss the relationship between them is to miss the point of the gospel and Jesus' crucifixion, and to miss what the church needs to be in America. So before I read some from the book, I want to. They're starting to do a whole stack of hands, some extra ones. Actually, there aren't any ones for these. I didn't put all my summaries on the sheets. So I'm gonna.
Is there an extra handout?
No, she didn't have one because that's why I gave it to her.
They might have. So I just wrote a brief detail of what each chapter is about. Does anybody think they're gonna go read this book later? Possibly. I wasn't sure if you like to hear about books or we're,
Yes, we love books.
like to read them all ourselves or not. So chapter 1, Cohn describes the history of lynching, how it traumatized the Black psyche with terror, while also polluting the white psyche with violence and evil. Talks about how arbitrary and humiliating the violence was, how essential it was to white power, and how Black people found expression, resistance, and hope in both blues music, place where they could find resistance, and the religion of Jesus, especially his suffering and death on the cross at the hands of the power crazed. So it's a tough chapter to read. He goes into detail about some of the lynchings. I think the first quote on the chapter 1 that you have in the handout talks about how it was like a family picnic event to go to a lynching and to take a photo of yourself in front of the body and send it to your friends and say, this is the barbecue we had last weekend, which makes me want to throw up.
Parents brought their children.
Yes, to enculturate them into it. Actually, one of the quotes from the last chapter was terrible, but spot on. It was one white man told another white man, lynching is part of the religion of our people. And Cohn said that Blacks have always wondered how whites could live comfortably with this absurdity.
And I didn't realize the Ku Klux Klan was founded by a Methodist minister.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. That's terrible. Yeah, I thought one of the things I found really interesting about the book, I'm not sure which chapter it was in, was how quickly the white narrative of what Black people were changed as soon as slavery ended. So before that, they were, Cohn says, mammies and sambos, they were harmless, they were caring, especially, the Black slave women who are raising their children. They had a lot of respect for these character types, and these were the tropes, but as soon as slavery ended, they were all dangerous. The men were rapists, the women were harlots, and it just switched on a dime so that they could keep their power. And I think it was very interesting how, like, as soon as you lose some power, your power comes through story. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so in this chapter, he talks about Judge Lynch, who was someone who would deal out a lot of vigilante justice, a lot of sentences to anyone when the court system wasn't fully developed in America. So lynching before the Jim Crow era was something that could happen to anyone. It was communities coming together to say, we need to take care of ourselves and this person is dangerous. So only in the Jim Crow era did that become associated with senseless killing of Black people. And it was always the story of, we have to protect our women. This person is a rapist. It always came under the story of who are we protecting. There were stories of people writing to presidents, please just say that this is a bad thing, and none of them would. Chapter 2, Cohn criticizes theologian and social ethicist Reinhold Niebuhr for missing the obvious connection between crucifixion and lynching. Niebuhr was renowned for his work on the social gospel, identifying Jesus' solidarity with the poor and oppressed, and desentimentalizing the Christian account of the cross. So he was someone who should have picked up on this. He was someone who was advocating for African American rights, maybe the only white theologian in that time doing that. And even he, who went so far to connect the gospel of Christ, lived experience of the marginalized, even he failed to make the connection. Chapter 3 is about Martin Luther King's journey, the freedom movement. It starts with a detailed description of the lynching of Emmett Till, and the courage of Emmett Till's mother. And so Martin Luther King Jr. social ethics, activism, pacifism, and his theology of the redemptive suffering of Jesus' cross are outlined. And King had a phrase that was the title of the chapter. He was known to see his ministry as carrying his own cross. He was bearing his cross. People like Emmett Till's mother were very clear in saying, my son will not have died in vain if we can create some movement from this. If people can see what happened to him, a child, an innocent child, maybe things can be better for all of us. So I think we have a tendency to really resist any sort of glorification of suffering, right? Because that's been something in the Christian tradition for a long time. Especially Christianity of power says, it's okay for me to inflict suffering because those who suffer are like Jesus, so I'm blessing them, right? That would get a lot of weight, but this was a common thing that was preached during the time of slavery. You know, you should be glad because you get to be like Jesus, lucky you. So we resist the glorification of suffering, but also making meaning out of suffering is so important for those who have experienced it. And I think we all have times in our lives where we have gone through suffering that we have worked really hard to make meaning out of, so that we can integrate that into our identity and our life story. Without finding meaning in suffering, it's much harder to process that, right? So there's the meaning making of it, the finding purpose in it, but not glorifying it is a tough thing. And Cohn says that Dr. King did that really, really well. He's been criticized for glorifying suffering, but actually he was just doing a really good job saying our suffering is not meaningless because Jesus' suffering was not meaningless. And
Can you all hear? Can you hear okay? No.
oh no, I'm sorry.
Just speak a little louder and also sometimes speak to them.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can speak to them.
I'll speak a little louder, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
So, and then in chapter 4, after talking about this paradox of glorifying suffering versus finding meaning in suffering, he says art and literature actually do a better job of describing that. So he jumps into some examples of Black art and Black literature, specifically the song by Billie Holiday, "Strange Fruit," and does shows a lot of different art that brings out the relationship between Black suffering and Jesus suffering. And then in chapter 5, he makes sure to name several women who are active during the freedom movement, who use their voices and their platforms to speak truth to power, and who very often pointed to Jesus' cross for their strength and inspiration, specifically Emmett Till's mother. Fannie Lou Hamer was another one.
That's okay.
So yeah, that's my quick summary of each chapter of the book. Any questions or thoughts on any of those?
That's very powerful. It's not the version of the gospel that we've heard
Yes.
or of lynching.
Yes.
Yeah, I love this very first sentence from Acts. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree. How did we miss that?
How did we miss that, right? Because we had to. We've been white society only functions if we are blind to that.
And I had never heard of lynching as a child at all. I was surprised that it still was going on.
That was another question I had for some of you, because lynching would have been happening in your lifetime. Is that something you remember as a child, or?
We talked about it.
I remember hearing about it. Yeah.
Not as a kid, I don't remember hearing about it. Well, I was in a pretty small town.
I thought all of the anti-Black prejudice was in the South.
Mhm.
And since I lived in the North, we didn't have it.
We're good.
Now, since then, I've learned a little more.
Yeah.
And I realized that, no, that's not true.
Yeah.
But, and I was surprised when he said that a lot of the lynchings did take place in the North or the West. Some of them, anyway.
Yeah, some in Minnesota.
California.
Well, I had the pleasure of having a 10-year assignment to live in Dallas, Texas, and being brought up here in the West. It was just a really big exposure to a lot of things, because I had representatives in the Southeast that I would go visit, and they would talk about their slang and the idea of how Blacks were considered. But a lot of it was done out of respect, because that's what the language was that's been passed on of, even if it was new to us. I'll just share one quick incident. My son, as a 7th grader in Dallas, was asked to do a living book report on something that he had no idea what it was. And he chose the Ku Klux Klan because people had talked about it and he had no idea what it was. So it was supposed to be a living book report that he could give to the PTA along with other students. And the night that he got out there to do this, he was so scared to participate, because people thought if he even talked about this, he must be proactive in his beliefs. So
He must be negative in his beliefs.
yeah, it just very well. He was pointing out the critical side, but if he pointed out just doing this book, it was something out of fear of how others would interpret.
Did he do it?
He didn't do it.
Wow.
The teacher announced his name, but I don't want to get too far off this, but I think we all are, let's say, brought up in the area that we've been raised in, what's been shared. And I think a lot of these things, it's nice to have this book to kind of open up an insight of, a whole different side of really what did go on.
And speak the things that we're
Yeah.
enculturated not to speak
Yeah.
about.
Well, I think I've never looked at this lynching and comparing it to Jesus on the cross. So I think that in itself is something that we can put it in perspective, that there's been a lot of suffering from our own Savior to people just kind of saying this is the right thing to do. Yeah.
And isn't it crazy, I think is the right word, that so many human rights issues have become party issues.
Mm-hmm.
I can't talk about this human rights issue because people will think that I'm not a Republican.
Yes. Well, it's just
Mm.
it's I posed a question here a couple of weeks ago in our class discussion about the word evangelism, which for us in our bringing up and I think Kelly hit a word here that just resonated with me. Instead of looking at giving something a label, progressive or conservative, is that we're followers of Jesus. And that makes it, to me, a very unified statement of this is where we're at. And I think it's an invitation to all to say that we're a follower of Jesus.
Yeah.
We all sit at the same table.
I think
Big
though that there's a difference between evangelism and evangelicalism.
Yeah.
So evangelism is talking to others about your faith. Evangelicalism is a movement within the church.
That has grown to mean something different than the original word.
Yeah.
Which is not the same as evangelism. there's a difference.
And it's, I was out to dinner with some British friends yesterday, and we were talking about, they've been to conservative churches in England, non-denominational churches in England, and they said they've been to some here too, and it is night and day difference. The way that some of the churches they've been to seem controlling. And I
In
was,
the US or?
yeah, in the US, and I was very curious, how much of the culture of white supremacy is baked into that church movement, because so much of our American Christianity, all of our American Christianity went through the time of slavery and has in some way been affected by it. And if it is not affected in the way that James Cohn offers, it's going to be affected by the Christendom, the Christianity of the powerful, who said, "Aren't you lucky you get to suffer? You're like Jesus." Yeah, you make a face every time I say that. That's appropriate. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question, but I see Al has been trying to get
Al.
asking for a bit.
Did you have something, Al? You're still muted.
Yes, I do. We've been throwing around some words, I think, too loosely. The first word I'll mention is lynching. Lynching is hanging by rope when we use it specifically to apply to Negroes. White men are strung up, and even more Native Americans, and you don't. Occasionally with Native Americans, you'll see the term used, but I think we have to think of lynching as a specific hanging by a rope act, and not as a more general term.
I think it did start that way, like I said in the first chapter, the name came from Judge Lynch, who would encourage vigilante justice in places that didn't have a court system. And so at that time it was all races who could be lynched. But over time it came to mean not an act of justice, but an act of terror, specifically against African Americans. And even now people will use that term to refer to any innocent Black person who was killed without due cause. Not that there was ever due cause, but I think that the term has evolved over time to have a different sort of meaning.
Yeah, but that's through usage. Now, what I don't know, and now I'm going to wonder, and I'm going to check it out, was lynching named after Judge Lynch? For all I know,
That's what she just said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what I understood, I only read a very small portion of this book, so I defer to Austin, but one of the things that I understood from that little description is that it's an extrajudicial mob violence judgment on someone without going through the process of law. And so by the mob and then hanging them from a tree, and sometimes burning them, but without the process of justice having gone through. And that many of these lynchings of Blacks didn't know, there was no trial of Emmett Till for what he was alleged to have done. And so that's, and that's where a parallel with the cross too, whereas it was not, Pilate made a decision, but it was an unjust killing with no proof of him having committed any crime.
Mm-hmm. And Pilate knew Jesus has committed no crime, but I'm going to give the people what they want.
Right, so it was mob justice.
Yeah, and Emmett Till, even what he was thought to have done, was not a crime.
Right.
To whistle at someone. And Emmett Till, we call Emmett Till's death a lynching. He was not hung, he was beaten and shot and thrown in a river.
So it's really extrajudicial
Yes.
mob violence killing of people, initially of any people, because what Judge Lynch was talking about, when in the West, they didn't have their judges and their full police and sheriff, so sometimes they did take it into their own hands.
And it was a way to maintain the safety of the community. But I think one of the narratives around lynching was always, we are doing this to protect our community. We have to protect our women, we have to protect our children. And so white people assumed or told themselves that anyone that they were lynching had done something to deserve it, was a criminal in some way. And I think this book does a good job in showing instances where everyone knew that the person was completely innocent. At the beginning of chapter 5, there is a graphic description of a woman who was lynched, a pregnant woman who was lynched, because her husband was lynched when the mob couldn't find the person they were intending to lynch. They just grabbed her husband instead. And she said, that's not right. She said something against it. And so they killed her too. And I won't go into detail, but you can check it out.
I don't know if anybody's read, probably had Uncle Tom's Cabin. That was the very first look into, for me, when I read that book, and I just started reading more books, but that was one of the first ones I read. And you know, you can see why they believed in Jesus in that book too. So
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that we deal with in our faith is how to deal with the problem of suffering, our own suffering, suffering in the world. And when we are faced with it, it often creates a crisis of faith in us, right? But reading the stories of people who have been oppressed, people who have gone through terror, people who have seen lynching their whole life, when they cling to Jesus because they have to, and their suffering does not make them question, is God really with me? Their suffering makes them draw near to Jesus. And so I think that's one of the reasons that listening to the voices of the marginalized and oppressed and those who have gone through suffering is so important for our own faith. Because like Cohn discusses, they know Jesus in a way that maybe we don't, or in a way that we can't process. They see the crucifixion in ways that are new to us. So I grew up with a pretty, my faith is me and God. The cross is good news because it saved me from my sin, a very sentimentalized view of the cross. And only in college did I learn more of the social terrain around the crucifixion, and think about that politically and what that meant, what that looked like. And come to see like, oh, Jesus being crucified, God being crucified, that should be bad news. And that was new to me for the first time, that this was a bad thing that happened, rather than something you wear as a necklace.
We had one member of our church who had grown up in the Dutch Reformed Church, and she was taught never to wear a cross as a ornament, a jewelry or anything, that was a torture symbol, and that you should not put torture symbols on your body. Mary Sigmund.
makes sense.
Oh, yes.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And if we think the relation, if you wore a lynching tree on your neck, like brings that to the fore, doesn't it? All right, we're low on time. Okay.
Yeah, you only got, she has to preach a sermon, so we're not gonna keep it forever.
Oh, yes, it's okay, it's written already. Anyone can do it.
Anyone can do it.
I want to read from the first chapter. Nobody knows the trouble I see. And I'm going to try to read loud because I know you don't have a copy in front of you. So the first quote is from Acts 10. It says, they put him to death by hanging him on a tree. And then the next is a description in 1915 of a lynching of Thomas Brooks in Tennessee. It says, hundreds of Kodaks clicked all morning at the scene of the lynching. People in automobiles and carriages came from miles around to view the corpse dangling from the end of a rope. Picture cards, photographers installed a portable printing plant at the bridge and reaped a harvest in selling the postcard showing a photograph of the lynched Negro. Women and children were there by the score. At a number of country schools, the day's routine was delayed until boy and girl pupils could get back from the viewing of the lynched man. The paradox of crucified Savior lies at the heart of the Christian story. That paradox was particularly evident in the first century when crucifixion was recognized as the particular form of execution reserved by the Roman Empire for insurrectionists and rebels. It was a public spectacle accompanied by torture and shame. One of the most humiliating and painful deaths ever devised by human beings. That Jesus died this way required special explanation. It made no rational or even spiritual sense to say that hope came out of a place called Golgotha, the place of the skull. For the Jews of Jesus' time, the punishment of crucifixion held special opprobrium. Given their belief that anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. Thus, St. Paul said that the word of the cross is foolishness to the intellect and a stumbling block to established religion. The cross is a paradoxical religious symbol because it inverts the world's value system with the news that hope comes by way of defeat, that suffering and death do not have the last word, and that the last shall be first and the first last. That God could make a way out of no way in Jesus' cross was truly absurd to the intellect, yet profoundly real in the souls of Black folk. Enslaved Blacks who first heard the gospel message seized on the power of the cross. Christ crucified manifested God's loving and liberating presence in the contradictions of Black life. That transcendent presence in the lives of Black Christians that empowered them to believe that ultimately, in God's eschatological future, they would not be defeated by the troubles of this world, no matter how great and painful their suffering. Believing this paradox, this absurd claim of faith was only possible through God's amazing grace and the gift of faith grounded in humility and repentance. There was no place for the proud and the mighty, for people who think that God called them to rule over others. The cross was God's critique of power, white power, with powerless love, snatching victory out of defeat. The sufferings of Black people during slavery are too deep for words. That suffering did not end with emancipation. The violence and oppression of white supremacy took different forms and employed different means to achieve the same end, the subjugation of Black people. And Christian theology for African Americans maintained the same great challenge to explain from the perspective of history and faith how life could be made meaningful in the face of death, how hope could remain alive in the world of Jim Crow segregation. These were the challenges that shaped Black religious life in the United States. I think I'm gonna stop with the reading there. There's several pages in the conclusion that I wanted to share with you. Maybe if you take the handouts home, you can read some of them. But I have some discussion questions. Maybe we can skip number one, what stands out to you from this book? Is there anything that sounds new to you? I think we've touched on that a little bit. Where do you see connections in the Black experience and therefore Black religious experience that challenge, deepen, or reinforce your faith?
I think speaking out that, even with the end of slavery and emancipation, there was still a hesitancy that even, how do I handle this? And I think today, to have a good discussion is to look at where we're at today and how much have we learned from a lot of this. And where do we maybe complete the story like Paul Harvey, the rest of the story yet to be determined. I think there's so much here. And I think within your youth group, this would be a great thing about talking about their own faith journey, where they're at today, that would really have a lot of meaning.
I shared a little bit about this book when I was talking with my other youth group at Redmond. We did a confirmation class and talking about what the cross means. I brought this up, and they hadn't heard of lynching. It was a new word to them. They also think it's something that was really far in the past. I had a volleyball coach in high school who grew up in the South, and when I was 15, he was telling us that in kindergarten, his best friend was lynched. And as a 14-year-old, that was terribly shocking. But to hear someone who saw that happen, his best friend was a 6-year-old. He was a white man, he was friends with a black boy. And just knowing that like that is something that has taken place in
Living memory.
It's not something that is past, that it's done, that we've already dealt with, that we don't need to bring up anymore.
One thing that really struck me was the effect of fear that lynching had on the blacks, the way James Cohn described it, which is that they would try so hard in the North and the South to just get along and appear to white people to be a good Negro, and it changed their behavior every day in dealing with white people. So for me, growing up as a white in the North and seeing blacks who were like that, it never occurred to me that they were like that out of fear.
They were hiding something.
Yeah, well, just think how much stress they were living
Yeah.
under. And then if they still tried to do the right thing, then it seems like the white people decided they had to have a lynching just to keep it in their minds. This is gonna keep going on, and somebody that was innocent was gonna get lynched. I mean, that's horror. I mean, that's terrorism, you know?
Well, and Cohn says like, this is something we need to talk about. This is something that Black people do not want to talk about because it is constantly traumatizing to remember this world.
But they still have trauma in our world, Black people.
Yes.
Well, and I was gonna say that, and it's not to take the side of lynching, but what we do now is we kind of, especially in our part of the world, we cover things up. We don't have lynchings and stuff, but we still do horrible things to people, but it's neat and tidy and you don't see it and your kids aren't exposed to it, and it's
Right.
just kind of,
So the redistricting,
Yeah.
and the war on drugs,
Yeah.
and the prison system.
yeah,
Or the redlining, or
Yeah.
it maybe doesn't strike quite as much terror, different, but it's still it's damaging.
But if we take it out of the history books, then it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
It's all about the story we tell.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And we didn't hear this story growing up, and it was happening all around us.
Yeah. When in the chapter on Martin Luther King Jr., Cohn talks about how gracious King was towards white people, constantly calling them their brothers and saying like, this evil has affected you and we want healing for you too. Which was so powerful to be able to say that time. And even the night before he was assassinated, he talked about knowing that he could be assassinated and that he's okay with that because he is following Jesus's call on his life. Incredible.
Yes.
I'm like, yeah, that's what Christians should do. But nothing's that bad that I need to do that. Right? Everything's okay now. It's the myth. So how does comparing crucifixion to lynching match with your understanding of Jesus' death on a cross?
Well, because Jesus, and he shouldn't have died, like he shouldn't have been hung on a cross, so, and they shouldn't have been lynched. And they're seeing that Jesus had to go through this and he didn't get justice either, but then in the end, they see that there's hope.
It creates a lot of dissonance for us as we process the cross, doesn't it? Because Jesus was saying that this is what has to happen. And, we grew up thinking that was so providential that like God planned this. But then we wonder, right? Like, was that the plan all along, or was that just inevitable because of what Jesus was saying in the world? Is this just what happens when you say the true thing? Did it have to happen that way? Were there other ways it could have happened, but this is just how people are? It brings up a lot to wrestle with.
And he wasn't gonna be quiet either.
Mhm.
He was gonna fight for justice for
Yeah.
other people, which was the minimalized in the, you know.
Yeah, and it wasn't the powerful that were going to kill him, right? It was his own community that wanted to
Yeah, because.
make sure the powerful didn't come for them.
Yeah, he did, you know, the powerful in the Hebrew Jewish community didn't want to lose their status, so they became powerful.
Yeah.
Must be time for church, huh?
Oh, no, is it already?
Yeah, I think so. To wrap it up.
I think, Kelly has defined progressive theology as paying attention to the voices that haven't traditionally been listened to. Side note, the phrase cancel culture, this really bothers me that cancel culture is a thing that people get upset about because the marginalized people have always been canceled.
Yes.
And so now that those who have been marginalized have more voice to say, we're not gonna listen to you just because you're in power. You have to earn our respect and our listening to you. It just bugs the crap out of me that people are like, oh, cancel culture is a new thing. Anyway,
Yeah, but we always think we're creating these things.
yeah, so listening to these voices, I think, is not just something that we're commanded to do out of love, it's not just something that we need to do in order to take care of people that God cares about. I think it's something that our faith needs. Our faith cannot be complete without hearing about these experiences, without hearing about the voices of the oppressed. I think our understanding of the crucifixion and why is this good news requires hearing from people for whom it is truly good news, who have experienced that in their communities and their bodies. Similar to Elie Wiesel, the Jewish theologian coming out of the Holocaust. He coined the phrase "God of the gallows" because he was there watching a child being hung at a concentration camp because the child was so small, it took about a half an hour. And there's people standing there watching, being forced to watch, saying, where is God? Where is God now? Where is God in this? And he says, an answer rose up from within me. God is on the gallows. God is either like hanging there with the child, or God is nowhere. God is on the lynching tree, or God is nowhere. Because the only good news that can come from these experiences is that we worship a God who goes through them with us, who knows the experience, and who can do something different on the other side of it. So I think my understanding of why the cross is good news, why the cross isn't just what happened before the resurrection, but the cross itself is good news. Because life with God doesn't mean we won't suffer, right? Life with God means that there is nothing we go through that will alienate us from God or from a community of faith. Which is the good news that we can hold on to and remember when we encounter suffering that feels like, this is the thing that's gonna break me, right? This is the thing that's gonna cause me to say, God can't be here. Like many of the Jews after the Holocaust, there's a movement called protest atheism. The God that I worship could never let this happen, so it's more respectful for me to stop believing that God exists. But Jesus is the thing that allows us to not do that.
Amen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Wait, how much, church can start late, right?
No. Thanks, leave the books and we'll take a slow. You need to get them.
Oh, I'm so excited about all the books. I put novels on the sheet too. If you're like, I don't really like reading memoirs or nonfiction, some of the novels are great for processing some of these issues as well. I just read The Water Dancer last year by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's a slave narrative. It has some magical realism in it. Harriet Tubman makes an appearance. It was beautiful.
Well, thank you.